Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, where intent and impact drive the inquiry of our conversations. We've decided to do a compilation for you.
So hopefully this is an instructive episode of how we can navigate all the different intersections.
Absolutely. Hopefully, you will enjoy these.
We're really excited today, and I'd say a bit courageous, as we're doing two brand new things at the same time. We're doing our first true live episode, and we're including our first guest. And I'm so inspired today by our first guest, Sally Helgeson. She is a premier expert on women's leadership, a best-selling author and international speaker. And she's going to talk to you today about not just women in leadership, but also about the whole concept of inclusive leadership. So without further ado, we will bring Sally into the picture. Sally, welcome to the intersection.
Well, thank you so much, Philip and Terry. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I love this idea of the intersection. That's where we all are now, and we're all trying to figure out how to make it work in the most powerful way we can.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for being a guest. I think it was some years ago when you and I met, and we've had some powerful conversations. But most importantly to me was your work. Your purpose behind your work and your passion behind your work, and that's why I've gained as much admiration for you as I have, because you're always at the intersection, as we say, but you're always tackling those tough conversations as well.
Exactly. And it's interesting reflecting back. I came into this work in women's leadership 35 years ago with the book, The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, which was the first to focus on what women had to contribute rather than how they needed to change and adapt. And that had come out of my own experience working in corporate communications during the 1980s and noticing what a poor job the organizations I was part of did at understanding what women had to contribute as leaders. So it's been a pretty consistent thread that has broadened out to the larger topic of inclusion over the years. But really, I have been fired by the mission from the very start of being able to help women and other people who are outside the standard leadership mainstream to recognize, articulate, and act on their greatest strengths, and help leaders understand what those strengths are so they can build more inclusive organizations.
Well, I want to let our listeners know that Sally has an unbelievable website with a great blog, and I did a lot of study on it, getting ready for the thing. And one of the things that just struck me right out of the gate of one of your recent posts was about the Old Boys Network. And as somebody who unfortunately has begun to look like part of the Old Boys Network, I just would like for you to share with our listeners a little bit about that and how folks can navigate that in a more effective way.
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I did write about it in one of my most recent newsletters, if not the most recent, how to navigate the Old Boys Network, around and with the Old Boys Network. In many organizations, the Old Boys Network is fairly established, and I would say in the last 7 to 10 years, it has often opened up a little bit to include people that don't necessarily look like or have the same background or experience as the standard old boys who ran most organizations up through 2010 or so. But despite that, despite the fact that it can look a little more inclusive, Old Boys networks tend to be self-reinforcing. Their strength is that they really are about leveraging relationships, and that's their purpose. It's not just building relationships, it's how people within them leverage relationships. Their weakness is that they tend to be not very inclusive and not very open. And this causes problems for people who are outside the mainstream, who are looking at the possibility of enhancing and building their own leadership strengths, how to get in. And it's hard to get in. And what I really recommend, because I've seen it work over the many decades I've been doing this work, is that start building your own network. Start building your own network internally with peers and colleagues. Start, very importantly, building your own network externally with people in your field, because this is what gives you strength. This is what you can forge connections that are as powerful, and you can get as much information and advice if you're willing to do the work that comes with building your own network. So that's really where we want to put our energy, not complaining about the old boys network. Okay, it exists. It's an issue. And it can operate in a way that's very exclusive. But what we can do in the face of this is to build our own networks. I'm big on what we can control rather than all the many issues that can concern us.
You know, Sally, I couldn't agree more with you because I look at it from two perspectives. The first perspective is, of course, for a lot of old boy networks, I'm just not going to fit. And I understand that I'm not going to fit. But then the question I ask is one of my favorite questions. How do I make it work? How do I still achieve what I'm seeking to achieve? And that probably is one of the reasons that Dr. Brown and I connected as friends. And as you say, create your own network, which, of course, our friend Marshall Goldsmith says the same thing. Hey, we have the Marshall Goldsmith 100, but create your own networks in your own local areas that will allow you to continue to do the work. So the question I have for you is, in creating your own network, what are the consequences, or what are the pros and the cons of, one, creating an inclusive network, which I know that's, or not creating an inclusive network? How do we help navigate and possibly eliminate the status quo?
Well, I think that the way we navigate the status quo is to build up our own strength. Mm-hmm. The one thing that I have noticed over the 35 years I've been in this field of inclusion and leadership is that the way organizations are most likely to change is when they're drawing from a more diverse leadership pool. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of chicken and the egg thing. I always advocate doing what you can to build up your own strength. I often get feedback where people say, well, isn't that just playing into the game, of not taking it on, of not taking the system on? Well, no, it's not, because first of all, it's very difficult to make systemic changes when you don't have real influence and positional power. Our friend Marshall always quotes Peter Drucker as saying, the person who gets to make the decision is the person in the position to make the decision. That is not necessarily the best person, not necessarily the wisest person. That's the person that gets to make the decision. So what we want to do is to increase the likelihood that we will have greater decision-making power, greater influence, and greater visibility in our organization, our community, whatever sphere we're operating in, our university. So by doing that, we to some degree, if we build strong networks, create alternate centers of power. So our organizations become more web-like in their structure rather than so hierarchical and so limited. So that's a good thing. But also we increase our own likelihood of getting into a position where we can really make a substantive difference. So that's really, I think, a more effective way to think of it. And that's why in my new book, Rising Together, I make a big distinction between what are networks and what are grapevines. Grapevines are usually systems where we share information from a point of powerlessness. And this is how they have evolved over time. But in that way, because they disseminate and share information, grapevines have a certain degree of power. But they are often, one of the characteristics of them is that they're an alternate center of power that of people who have no power. So and they often, as a result, default to complaint. One example, let me be more specific. I give a wonderful example in the book that if you read my newsletter, you probably heard about, and it's in the new book. Of what's called the Alori Sisterhood, which is a group of African-American political operatives in New York State. And they, had, they found themselves excluded from a major meeting by the Latino and African-American men who are also political operatives. They found themselves excluded from a major meeting, and they were this about 10 or 12 years ago. They didn't even get the notification. So they decided to create their own meeting. And the men who excluded them actually crashed the meeting. So they decided to start meeting in one another's homes. And what they did was they took a very deliberative approach to being a network rather than a grapevine, in that they made the decision that what they were going to do was to leverage one another's connections to build support for one another in terms of getting into more powerful positions, share relationships, share connections, share information. Oh, here's a job. I'm going to recommend you for this. Our whole group is going to stand behind you and help you prep for your interview for that. And the result has been that the network, the Alori Sisterhood, is still together after 12 years. And they have placed women in positions of real power, including the chief of communications in the Biden administration. These were people who are knocking on doors 12 years ago. So it really worked. And I think the two lessons we can take from that network are, number one, focus on leveraging the relationships you have. And number two, don't get caught in feeling excluded from the power structure. Create your own power structure. And over time, that can develop very powerfully.
So connected to that, Sally, is the whole concept of allyship. So let's take the situation where maybe you got one or more of the people in the groups you're talking about, the own network, develop some strong allies within the old boy network. What would that look like?
Well, and in fact, that's what happened. But guess what happened? The old boys network members started coming to them because they saw that they were successfully leveraging the power they had and getting into positions of influence. So more of what that teaches us is that more effective than feeling, oh, we're excluded, we're not part of that. What are we going to do? Why won't they let us in? They're, not behaving inclusively. They're shutting us out. Rather than that, the idea was, okay, let's create the conditions where we can have more power and influence, and then they'll come to us. And that's exactly what happened. And that's how things evolve. I do have one other thing to say that's interesting about building these external networks that are alternate centers of power, is that research shows, particularly that done by Dr. Boris Groysberg at Harvard, I think it's the School of Education, not School of Business, although he mostly writes about business. But he did some really interesting studies of Wall Street analysts and what made their skills portable. And what he discovered, this is a huge, major study that he published, a big, thick book called Chasing Stars, sorry. And what he discovered is that generally the men who were star analysts did a very poor job of carrying their ability to be star analysts to different organizations, whereas the women did a pretty good job of it. And in digging down, he had no way, this was very quantitative, his research, he had no way to account for that difference. So he started doing some interviews and more qualitative stuff with women. And what he discovered was there were a number of reasons. First of all, the women really looked at the new culture. You know, if they were at one investment firm and they got an offer from another, they really looked at the culture and thought, is there a fit? Where the men tended to be like, okay, it's a no-brainer, they're offering me X amount of more money. So they were more aware and cognizant of culture. But the other thing he found is that they had external networks that really helped them, whereas the men tended to be very connected in the old boys network internally in their organizations because they had access to it, and it didn't help them when they were out, when they were in another organization. So they kind of had to start over from scratch. So in terms of building a career where your skills are portable, external networks are also very powerful.
That is awesome. And you know, Sally, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because back in 2016, I did some work with 20 women executives at a large insurance company. And what I found in my research and as I prepared was that women over the age of 40, compared to their men counterparts, were much better leaders from a EQ perspective, simply because some were mothers, and that whole nurturing aspect that came into not only nurturing children at home, but nurturing their employees, as well as being more empathetic to others in the workplace. You know, you have a great book titled How Women Rise, which I've read, which is outstanding. And as we talk about inclusion, and I'm sure some of the younger audience who are out in the corporate world, the younger women would like to know, what are some of the steps that they could try to avoid that would enable them to rise and to be more inclusive in the workplace?
So this is advice for younger women in terms of being able to rise and be more inclusive in the workplace?
Yeah, I would say yes, simply because some of them are just entering the workspace. They don't have that experience, and if they were, I guess, newbies, for lack of a better word, going in, how could they hit the ground running and understand the power of inclusiveness? And what advice could you give to them?
Well, I think the advice I would give to them first would be threefold. One is focus on your own strengths. Get a sense of what those strengths are as soon as you can in your work life. It takes a while to recognize that. But if you're looking for it, if you're constantly sort of asking, you know, what was my strength in that meeting? What could I have done differently? How could I have been better, more powerful? How could I have displayed my strengths? So what you really want to do is look at your strengths and then figure out how well you are, how you can articulate those strengths, so you can be very, very clear about that. And that's a really good way to do it, because then you start attracting other people. Secondly is to never undervalue the power of building relationships and building relationships broadly. I think one of the issues that has arisen in the last 10 years is there's been so much emphasis on mentors and sponsors, which is very important, of course, but it has been so emphasized that people have often forgotten that strong relationships benefit you when they are built at every single level. So you want to be as inclusive as possible in building relationships. You know, it's not just that transactional thing of you never know where someone else is going to end up. It's also, as you build relationships more broadly and you become more skilled at dealing with people who may have very different backgrounds from yourself, you develop allies, as Dr. Brown was talking about, in unexpected places, and that can help so much. as long as you're looking at it from the perspective of, how can I be of benefit to you as well? So that's really key. And the third thing, was I'm kind of reminded of it by the beginning of your question, where you talked about, in your observation, women leaders had developed more empathy from the experience of being mothers and sort of their domestic role. And I find that to be very true. I also hear a lot of younger women going on about, I don't know how I can do this and have a family. I don't think my job is aligned with being a mother. Maybe I need to choose, etc. We don't need to choose. Those skills are so translatable. And one of the stories that I most love, I was reading a profile of Nancy Pelosi in the Washington Post maybe 2 years ago. And the interview was about how she was managing this very fractious, large caucus and doing so superbly. And the interviewer asked her, he said, well, I'm assuming you have the ability to lead such a diverse and clamorous group of people because of the experience of your father, who was, I believe, the mayor of Baltimore and went on to be a congressman. So it was a very political environment she grew up in. And she said, watching my dad was helpful. She said, but what has really enabled me to lead this caucus is the fact that I had 5 children in 6 years. She said, if you can be a mother to 5 children in 6 years, you can manage anything. You can manage a war. You can manage a government. You can do it. And I just love that quote, because that really, one of the things that, to me, women have brought into the workplace is a permission to recognize that we all are full human beings. We have families. We have concerns that lie outside the workplace. I remember back in the 80s, women being told, don't put a picture of your kids on your desk. That will undermine your ability to be seen as a professional. I remember women having to duck out of major meetings to take a tiny, quick 1-minute call that had anything to do with their children, a babysitter being sick, etc. And that's not true anymore. Men and women, all of us, bring, the whole idea is bring your whole self to work. And often we develop talents and skills and connections in the community through our personal lives. So I think we need to recognize that we can, maybe we can't do it all at the same time. Although Nancy Pelosi was pretty busy while she was having her babies, but maybe we can't do it all at the same time, but we really can find individual ways to have a satisfying personal life and a satisfying professional life, and both are important.
Such a great discussion, and I've so many questions. I've got 2 parallel lines of thought going, but I want to take one. We kind of live in a world of paradoxes, right? It's certainly not an either or world. There are lots of ways things can happen, but the paradox I want to ask you about is, as a healthcare guy, I'm a surgeon by training, healthcare system executive now. One of the things we know for sure is that the top influencers for what happens to a family or a unit of any kind are the women. The number one influencer of the way someone seeks health care or how well they take care of them is always a female figure, often the maternal figure.
Yeah.
But yet in corporate world, we see something dramatically different. So it's a sort of a 2-part question. Why is that? And then what happens to bring balance to that? Because we know it's effective.
Well, it's a big structural question, particularly related to healthcare, that often has to do with the buy-up. I mean, I'm experiencing it in my own hospital system, got bought by a huge system that has massive amounts of debt in order to take it on. So all the decisions that are made are driven by the fact that they have the new parent, which is located half a nation away, is trying to deal with the debt from that leveraged buyout. So those are the kinds of structural decisions that are influencing the healthcare system now. We're certainly seeing it in nursing homes where there's a huge buy-up, often by hedge funds, of nursing homes, and so the money gets funneled away. So that's a structural issue in our late capitalist environment that is having a particular impact upon healthcare, I would suggest. And you're much more of an expert on this than I am, but it's having an impact on it, and it is keeping it in a kind of, I don't want to say male-centric way, but it's bringing in an aspect of hierarchy and control, command and control, that is keeping not only women down, but a lot of other people. I mean, I've heard this from, the guy administering the MRIs. He said, our goal here is to provide excellent customer service. Then the suits, as he calls them, visit us. And what they tell us is we've got to perform more MRIs in a day. And those two things don't work. So I think that we've got some structural healthcare issues here that make this arena particularly difficult. And, there's some long-term solutions, but it is interesting. And when you were talking about the healthcare decisions being driven by women, what I also realize is that, in marketing and advertising, something like 85% of all decisions about what to buy, what to purchase, including cars, are made by women. And yet the marketing and the distribution is done with the idea of a male customer. And they're awkward about how to address the female customer. So I think these are, they're different issues, because one is very structural and the other is just a kind of lack of imagination, really, the marketing and advertising world. But these are things that are holding back our ability to forge organizations that are more engaging to more people. And I think that's why the Gallup, even before the pandemic in 2018, that stunning Gallup survey that showed that something like 65% of people reported feeling totally unengaged at work, and another 20% mildly unengaged. So you had something like 18% of people being highly engaged. That's an issue. The good news is that organizations are starting to recognize that is an issue. If healthcare continues down this path, they're not going to be able to get anybody to work there. So that becomes an issue, especially as this country closes down a lot of immigration. So it's, the problem is on track to start to break some systems. And when that happens, then you can get a new pool of leadership. And that's what it often takes.
And you hit on somewhere in that commentary, you talked about the concept of lack of imagination. And I think that lack of imagination is one of the most important imperatives we need to understand in the realm of inclusion. That current lack of imagination, it can be fixed.
Well, that's exactly right. And the lack of imagination really ties very much to the points Terry was making about empathy. Mm-hmm. Because what is empathy really? It is the ability to, at the basic level, put yourself in another person's shoes. And how do we put ourselves in another person's shoes? We do that by imagining what their experience is. We do that by imagining the factors that brought them to think and act and behave and feel in the way that they feel. So it is an act. Empathy is really an act of imagination. And I think that it is often blocked by fear. And that's one thing I see, in the diversity and inclusion space, is that there's a lot of fear right now that you're going to get shut down if you possibly say the wrong thing, if you possibly appear the wrong way, etc. And this is blanket. And this is something that that I think is causing some problems. But the imagination and the empathy that results from imagination is the way out of this, because that fear freezes us from understanding what another person's reality and experience is like.
I'm Doc Philip Brown with my good friend Terry Jackson and our special guest Molly Chang, who he's going to introduce in just a moment. You know, the interesting thing about intersections is that we all face many intersections daily, and the way we navigate these determines the trajectory of our days and our lives. Terry, big day for us today.
It's a huge day for us. We're at an intersection, actually. We're at the intersection of communication and how we do it so skillfully. And we have a special guest with us this morning, and that special guest is Molly Chang. And she is the expert of Say It Skillfully. So Molly and I met several years ago as we were members of the Marshall Goldsmith 100. She's probably one of the best spirits I've ever communicated with. And so with that, Molly, how are you this morning?
Harry, Doc, I could not be any better than being with the bright lights that you are, and I am really grateful to be joining you and your listeners.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You know, give us a little bit about your background and how did you come up with this sage idea of Say It Skillfully?
Well, it's one of those things when life just happens because it took over as a night job. I'll be very honest with you. It's not been my main business, although I started it as one recently. But as a little bit of background, I grew up, my parents were from overseas. My dad's from the mainland and my mom is from Hong Kong. So we were first generation born in the States in upstate New York. And so really it was a bit of the immigrant dream. I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old, straight C's through first grade. So, it's one of those things people are like, what? And so I think I'm living proof that the ability to communicate is something you absolutely can learn. I think people might think I'm quite an extrovert. I'm actually quite an introvert. I derive my energy from within. And I have 2 darling sisters, 5 nieces and nephews. My parents are still with us. So very blessed. I've had a really, really great upbringing. And I'm a geek at heart. So I was an engineer in school and I had a broad-based business career that included working at places called US Filter and Cisco Systems, where I learned to integrate companies to the tune of over 80 acquisitions. I've worked with a lot of senior leaders through a lot of change, I would say. And so that has been a great privilege. And as you can imagine, you really learn a lot about people and getting people to work together and getting people to communicate. And I am not a big company gal. At my heart, I would say I'm more entrepreneurial, but I was at Cisco many, many years. I had a lot of really cool jobs. And then I would say I left on my own in 2014 to start my own company. And I really believe it's a privilege to lead. And it's an opportunity, a responsibility to lead well. And I saw a lot of really great people as leaders, but I'm going to be really honest, they weren't really working so great as a team. They wanted everyone else to work like a team. And I thought, well, that doesn't really work for me. So I ended up going off on my own and created Abella Consulting. And it's really about helping senior leaders win as one. Yes. So that's to commit to each other's success, to build that powerful chemistry to lead together, and to maximize the value that's created. So that's what I've been doing. And then we both had the privilege of meeting dear Marshall. And that just changed my life forever. And I innocently used this iPhone and I threw a video up on LinkedIn, and I'm not a social media person. And it was a conversation, 90-second conversation, how a junior person could speak up in a room full of management. And I thought like 10 people would watch the video, and like 36,000 people ended up watching this video. And I swear to you, it took over my life. I produced a video a week for almost a year, and I got over 1.5 million views. I got asked, do you want to have your own radio show? To which I said, yes, I want to have my own radio show. I don't even know what that means to have your own radio show. But it's a real passion of mine to help people be seen, heard, understood, frankly, so that we all work and live better together. And this idea of finding your voice, speaking up authentically, so that we're all understood, really, really moved me. And I find that a lot of people at work good people, senior all the way to junior, aren't really saying what they think needs to be said. And that just stinks for the individual, because you didn't go to, whether you went to, Yale or Oxford or community college, you didn't come to work to be a mute, right? You really wanted to contribute. And so I find it a real work injustice. And the thing is, the leaders think it's the people aren't speaking up. The people think the leaders don't want to hear it. I mean, to cut to the chase, right? And so what I realize is when people get that we're all part of the problem and all part of the solution in terms of speaking up, then we can really bubble up and get to what I call an accurate shared reality, right? Which is being on the same page, which you have to make the best decisions, execute with speed, and achieve your greatest outcomes. So it's such a duh, like it's like a giant neon light. So, and I've just been grateful for you, Terry, Dot, all the great support, because, at our core, every single one of us, present company included, every single one of us could be more skillful. And when you can communicate and express yourself in a way where the other person hears you, it's a great feeling. It's super empowering, and it's more effective. So it's just like this great series of wins. So
yes.
A little bit about the journey.
It's perfect, because I guess I probably found you originally online and then met you through Terry, as Terry brought you into the JCG group that was working with the executive team I was on at the time, that was in the middle of a large health system acquisition, or actually we were the acquiree. And so those were really powerful lessons. And then, I feel like I know you better than I really do. We never haven't seen you in person, but always, in one of these virtual forums. But I love the way you put those things out in the context of senior leaders win as one and how to do that. And one of the things that we've seen happen on our show is our guests are tending to be people who can show us how to do things, right? Like, pragmatically, how do you accomplish this? Everybody can get on board with the idea. Yeah, teams should function together. Great, right? Sounds good. How do you do it? And
That's right.
And so I was hoping to go through some things that I know you touched on several of them in your introduction, but this whole shared reality concept is so important. And I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, how we create these shared realities better.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing it up, because this is the number one disconnect that I've seen in organizations of all sizes, anywhere in the world, of any industry, right? And when we're not on the same page, it's really hard to do great work. And the deal is, there's very little objective reality other than the physical time, space, and distance of things. And so when I share this with people, I'm like, look, it is about the facts, for sure, but it's also the human experience is part of their reality, right? Doc's happy, Terry's sad, it's just it, and it informs where people are at and how they feel. And that's a super important part of working with people, and particularly of leading. And so that ability to really to be able to see that, and I mean, I'm fairly intuitive, you might guess that, right? But that ability to kind of sense where people I don't think that's only an innate skill. I think you can actually learn that. But it does take being in good relationship with yourself, meaning if you're really self-absorbed, it's very hard to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So I would say this notion of co-creating shared reality, which is to say, you see there's a given experience and people see it 10 different ways, right? And there's probably a little bit of right in every single one. So your ability to help people hear all voices, I call this hear all voices, including the unpopular ones that are harder to say, is the only way to get to that accurate shared reality. So that's where the skillfulness comes up, because if you're afraid that your boss is going to jump on your back for saying something that's, disagreeing with him or her, and you're not going to say it, well, then the group suffers because they're not actually getting your point of view. And your point of view may actually be wrong, but the data has shown that even the wrong points of view will help inform the cognitive thinking of a group. So it forces the group to be better, right? And so I think the ability for people to jump in and say, I may not be right. Let me just offer you this. versus that idea of, well, I've got to be right. So you come in with a declarative statement. Well, the world is green, you know? You're like, well, the world isn't green. And now you look dumb. So now you're never going to do that again, right? So it's, I think, helping people appreciate it isn't about the smartest person in the room, right? We all have things to contribute. And in terms of this practical, a lot of folks think, well, I don't have the answer. I don't have anything to say. But if you notice that, you know, gosh, we've heard from many of the same voices, but there's a bunch we haven't heard from. I'd love to hear from some folks who haven't spoken up yet. Oh my God, you've just given license for those quiets, we like to call them, to kind of chime into the conversation. I am traditionally a quiet. So we're like looking around, we're trying to get in, we can't get in because everyone else is talking. It's really tough, right? So for the quiets, the ability to go around and actually give space for people is a real gift.
You know, Molly, as I was listening to your response, one of the things that came to mind was knowledge of self. In order to really get to that shared reality, one must know oneself. When did you begin the journey of truly knowing who Molly is? And how did you do that so that our listeners could use that as advice for those who are not as confident, for those who may be introverts, but yet be able to speak out and for everyone to hear their voice? What would be the beginning of that journey for them?
That is the $10 million question. Thank you for asking it. This journey to getting to know ourselves for who we really are is a lifetime's journey. It is well worth it, and it is bumpy. So I have always been a bit of a self-helpy person, and I actually went through this. I listed out all the things I had done, whether it was books I read. I did a Tony Robbins course, a set of 11 CDs, and I moved east because of it. I've done yoga training. I've done, Alexander technique, the advanced. I mean, you name it. I kind of have always had sort of an interest in that. One, but two, I was pretty self-absorbed, not in a mean way, and I don't make myself bad or wrong. I think as young people, you can be a little bit self-absorbed. I was way more self-absorbed than I would like to admit. And, I think at one point you kind of realize you're going to work as one person and you're like, there's another person in there. It's kind of a pain to kind of switch around. And you start to realize, because I grew up, literally there was one Chinese, one Black, one Korean family in upstate. So we really wanted to fit in. I had a great upbringing, but I do recall just painfully wanting to fit in, and that's a lot of pressure. And I think it took a while to just, I didn't have a true north when I was younger. I think some people I thought were better at that. I was easily swayed for sure. But then I think, you become more mature, and we don't have enough hours in the day for me to sit down with all the ridiculous things, cringeworthy things that I did. I mean, really cringeworthy. Mortification, right? Those are the kinds of words. And so I could either be a boat anchor, be my worst enemy, and berate myself for the rest of my life, or I could say, look you've really screwed that up. Frickin' learn, be better. And I just think that's a choice I have never had. I was on had a Navy SEAL in my show recently, as you know, and he's never had, self-doubt or negative talk. I'm not one who is inclined to that either. That might be the practical engineer in me. I'm like, why would I be my worst enemy? I'm like, there's enough problems out there. So I think that journey helps you just see, the great of yourself and the not so great. I mean, we're all perfectly imperfect. You gotta love yourself for who you are. Newsflash. And I get that there are things that happened in people's past or what have you. And I do think that there's opportunity to make a conscious choice about, you're going to learn and move on. You're going to learn and wallow. If you need help, get help. I think there's a lot of, fortunately, I think it's, much better now. People can seek out resources. get in good relationship within.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the first part of Say It Skillfully, is absolutely leading oneself, figuring out what's going on for you. Are you mad? Are you angry? Are you sad? Are you tired? Whatever it is, right? And then making a choice that you have to exhale whatever might be negative and holding you back, and inhale a way that you can be useful to a person or to a conversation. And, you've heard our mentor Marshall say, hey, it's showtime. When you're a leader, sometimes you don't feel so great. And you know what? You kind of got to fake, because there's a lot of people counting on you. It doesn't mean you aren't real, but it does mean you have to do more than your fair share to show up in service to others. And as we all know, that's a real honor.
Yes.
Yes, we must be, universe has connected us in different ways in terms of how we process life, I think, based on what you're saying. Have always been one of those self-help people too, get coaching, take all these evaluations. I used to review them every year between Christmas and New Year's. That would be my time to get my mind right for the next year. But like the stack is getting too thick. I don't have that kind of time if I want to spend any family time. I've got to kind of get off that, right, and move on. But you said something in your last segment that was so powerful. I wanted to maybe ask you to explore it a little bit, because you were talking about the pressure to fit in. And I wanted to ask you if you could help draw out a little bit about differentiating, that pressure to fit in versus the need to contribute, and how those are different.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. This is, there's so much socially. When you think about young kids and social media, I mean, thank God, I'm old, because that just would be really hard, really hard. Like all these perfect lives and perfect everything. I mean, it's so not where anything is. So, I do think that when one has grounding in terms of sense of self, you may have pressure to fill in, but you have sense of self. Thank God to my parents. We just had a real sense of, you can do it. We were among the shortest in the class. We didn't, weigh that much. I mean, I always felt like I could, carry my own and then some, like always. And I worked in largely all male environments in a lot of my career. And it was never a chip on my shoulder. I never felt edgy, but I think because I was used to being lone person out, it never really fazed me. I just really went about my merry way. And I think this need to contribute, Tony Robbins has these 6 dimensions. And for some of us, that impact dimension is really strong. For me, it's very strong, right? I will assess things, and if it will change the world, has the potential to change the world, you have a much higher likelihood of getting my interest versus something that's nice to do or fun to do or what have you. So I think understanding the driver, some people are very connection oriented. They're very about the human connection, and there's not one right or wrong, but it's important to know what really drives you and moves you so that you can kind of seek those things and feel fulfilled. And I do think that success, it's just about living meaningfully, contributing in ways that are meaningful to you. And, if one life has been better because of yours, hey, that was worth it. Right. So, I think some people look at it more broadly. I think every single person on this planet has value to add, and it is a responsibility to try to add it. I was on an elevator in my building, and this guy was talking about, well, I'm going to retire soon. He's a really young guy. And I looked at him in a very cheeky way. I'm like, oh, no, you can't retire. He looks like, look. I'm like, how much golf and how much can you play and how much coffee can you drink? And I said, we got a lot of big problems in the world here. We need smart people on them. And you don't have to work full time. You don't have to get paid even, but you can't retire. You have to contribute, because the world needs all of us rowing, generally in the same direction, because we got a lot of stuff that we got to fix. So, I just want to offer that for folks. And you folks, we're all living the dream. I love what I do. You love. I'm like, I'm always going to do it in some way or form. It may not be, however, 60 hours a week or 40 hours a week or 20 hours a week. So I really encourage folks to think about what moves you, what brings you joy, the skills you have, how you can apply them. This is all getting to know ourselves for who we are, and it takes work, folks. Right? And you have to uncover things that you may not love about yourself. But still love yourself for it, because it is to who the human that you are. And that's okay. That's okay.
You know, Molly, you said a couple of things that really resonated with me. One, the retirement piece. I've often said I'm never going to retire, right? So that really, really resonated with me. And the impact piece, right? I'm always kind of assessing what is my impact. Am I having enough impact? Who do I need to become more impactful? And so when you talk about impact, I think that you're absolutely correct. There are lots of challenges that we face in this world that need to be addressed. Part of my mindset for 2023 is really addressing the world with truth. And in hopes that the truth will not be rejected, right? Whether it's rejected or not, I'd say I'm just going to speak it and go from there. Now, you always say everyone has a voice, and you say speak your authenticity into the world. In your working with organizations, and you mentioned kind of earlier that some people don't want to speak out and because they're fearful. How do we overcome the fear to actually say what needs to be said in a very strategic way, so that we can give the voice to the voiceless in organizations?
Yeah. I love this. So the fear, I think the first thing, getting back to the starting point of Say It Skillfully, and it's a me, you, we framework. So where am I? So leaning into fear without judging it. Like, okay, I feel afraid. That's important to know. Okay, why do I feel afraid? Well, the last person who said anything was, fired on the spot and was never hired again. Okay, well, maybe that's pretty legit. Okay, the guy spoke up and he was fired on the spot and never had a job again. That's a legit fear. So Molly is just on record here, not telling anyone to put your head on the chopping block. Okay, like
Right.
that's not right. So if you are in one of these situations, and I'm very, very serious about this, if you are in a place where where people don't really want to hear what people think, I'm going to really ask you, why are you there?
Mm-hmm.
Because you are enabling that culture to persist. And I'm really genuine about this. I get that some people can't afford the luxury of changing jobs. I think, so I honor that. And you have to know, if you're staying in a place which really has that bad of a culture, you're helping it persist. And so you've got to acknowledge that that's being a bit of part of the problem. You're not a bad person, but you're enabling it. So I just want to offer that to folks. First and foremost, you have to pick the place that deserves you. That does take some courage. That takes some sense of self-worth. I get it, but I would implore people to go there. For the rest, okay, is it a manufactured fear? Is it an excuse for me to not speak up because I can say I'm afraid? You got to get whole with that. The leaders I work with, at least, want the truth. They are not up there working their butts off day in, day out so that people lie to them. Okay, that's not what they want. Your experience may be that they're not as open as they think they are. Again, shared reality, different experiences. So therefore, there lies the opportunity. And so effective communication is about what others hear, not what you think you just said. That ability, you want to speak your truth, Terry, I got it. But it's incumbent that you create a fertile soil for that news to land. So that might be empathizing. Gosh, Susan, I can imagine it's, sometimes it can be really hard. People can be very critical. So I want you to know that I saw something that I think could be helpful. I don't mean it in a way of criticism. Would now be a good time to share it. Asking for permission. Give a person a chance. My head is exploding. I can't now, but how about tomorrow? Okay, great, Susan, I'll come back. I noticed X. I don't think that that's what you intended, right? I could see why people may not speak up as a result. And here's, I just want to throw that out there. Here's a suggestion, but that spirit of wanting to help someone versus judge them is very palpable, right? I can tell when someone cares about me and wants to help me. They may not even be perfectly skillful, but I can tell that positive intent. Now, if I'm going out to tell Susan she's the dumbest leader I've ever worked for, and she's, like, obviously that's going to come across people.
Right.
So that's the being good relationship with myself. Am I going out to prove Terry wrong? I'm going to show that Terry, he's so wrong. Okay, great, Mom. That's super.
Right.
Way to go. Golf clap. That's the ego getting the better of us.
That's right.
Or is your ego in check? And this notion of assuming positive intent. Look, I grew up feeling a bit judged, so it was very easy for me to judge. That was a big learning for myself. So I still have that tendency, but I can work it and say, look, am I creating meaning out of something that's not there? I have to really tone that down a little bit. So those are the micro things that are going on for me moment by moment. So I just want folks to know it's not a there, right? It's a continual practice of staying present, of assuming positive intent, of trying to express myself in a way that shows up as a partner, as a supporter to someone. Of course I fail, right? But that's at least what I'm trying to do.
Now we're talking about this shared reality concept, and we're talking about, your communication really has to do with how somebody receives it more so than what you intend to project. So that kind of brings to mind the concept of reality checking. So I was wondering if you could maybe give us some ideas of how you reality check that your communication has landed in the way you intended or needs revision.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have a phrase: transparency is our friend. Mm-hmm. So getting transparent. So especially if we're not on the same page, we want to have transparency of that. So you want to not judge that. That's great, right? When people are coming to you with things that may be hard to say. But lots of times for leaders, we can say a lot. Talk. And, it's a lot consumed. So the ability to kind of say, wait a second, I've been talking for like 3 minutes. I've said a lot. What are you hearing? Pause. Okay. And let people share what they're hearing, not in a, like questioning, did you hear the right thing? But hear and then thank you for sharing that. Perfect. I feel like that's the message that I wanted to have come across. Or, that's on me. I obviously was not clear about this one point. Let me try that again. Now, on both sides, if you're hearing someone and it's just kind of like, wah, 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 hey, 1 second, I have lost you. Do you do me a huge favor? I really want to understand you. Could you start over and let me try that again? Totally fair game, folks. We all daydream, we lose it, but don't be doing this when you really have no idea what's going on, because they think you understand and you don't understand, right? So that's where you have to get good relationship with yourself. Am I worried about looking stupid because I lost track, or do I really want to understand?
That's powerful. Do I worry about looking stupid, or do I really want to understand? For most people, I know what that answer would be, right? They don't want to look stupid.
Listen, I got to tell you, nobody wants to look stupid, right? I get it. So